So this first panel is looking at, all right, what lessons can we take then from sustainability and apply them toward addressing these challenges? We'll do that through the use of some case studies around the world, including the Persian Gulf, U.S.-China relationship, and then some more global perspectives on top of that as well. So we're really lucky to be joined by a distinguished panel to help us navigate through these weeks. And what I'll do is I'll introduce Megan first, and Megan will kind of tee us off here, and then I'll go ahead and introduce the other two as well, right? So Megan will begin. Megan Stiefel is an attorney and founder of Silicon Harbor Consultants, a firm that provides strategic cybersecurity operations and policy counsel. She currently serves as Cybersecurity Policy Director at Public Knowledge. In addition, she's Senior Policy Advisor to Technology for Global Security and is a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Cyber Statecraft Initiative. Megan previously served as Director for International Cyber Policy as well at the National Security Council, and most importantly is an IU alum. So we're very lucky to have her come back. Let me introduce Brian and Mario as well, then we'll return to Megan for her opening remarks here, okay? So Brian Ray has extensive experience in e-discovery, information governance, and cybersecurity, as well as data privacy. Brian co-founded and co-directs the Center for Cybersecurity and Privacy Protection at Cleveland Marshall College of Law, and since 2016, he served on the Ohio Attorney General's Cyber Ohio Advisory Board. So we're very lucky to have Brian with us too. And Mario's is an associate professor of international security and strategy. He's dean of the College of Security and Global Studies at American University of the Emirates, and he's currently authoring on alliances, international organizations, smart cities, and cybersecurity, among others, projects in the UAE. So as you can tell, lots of different perspectives, which is wonderful. That's exactly what we want. So to help us dig in, they'll do 5 or 10 minutes of opening remarks. I have some general questions, only a couple, and then I'll be indicating questions from you guys. So start to think what you'd like to ask, okay? And Megan, if you wouldn't mind, feel free to tee us off here.
Sure. Excuse me. First, just a quick thanks to my, as Scott said, alma mater. I'm a graduate of the law school here. Thanks to Emily and the team who've put this symposium together. I'm delighted to be here, and as I told Scott yesterday, I was giddy to get a chance to come back to campus. So I think this is a critical point in our use of the internet, and a time to really think. It's an inflection point, I think, and we've actually been sitting on this point for a while, but I think we're teetering. So first, I just wanted to take a few minutes to do what some people call set the table, and forgive me if I can do a little bit of polling. If you don't want to participate, it's all anonymous. I don't know who you are. Cybersecurity. Lisa already defined the way I'm going to also use the term cybersecurity. It's 3 actions taken to protect the confidentiality. It's not 3 actions. It's 3 attributes. We're trying to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. So as I throw around the term cybersecurity, that's what I mean. Any better?
I think so.
Yeah. There we go.
I think so.
I hate the sound of my own voice. In any event, the other thing I want to sort of set the table terminology-wise is I often use the phrase ICTs to include not just the internet, but it's information and communications technologies. Mm-hmm. So ICTs in the old days included your wireline phone and the mainframe or desktop computer. Now they include your refrigerator, your toothbrush, and quite possibly your toilet. So what is common among all of these things is that they all produce data. Mm-hmm. Data is the new oil. This is not something that I came up with. It's something that The Economist has suggested. The current White House cybersecurity coordinator, Rob Joyce, made the same analogy back in October of last year in DC. So I should also frame my remarks just by giving you, as Scott mentioned, a bit of my background. I come from the national security space. I investigated nation-state actors misusing the internet. I then did a little bit of work in the criminal space, investigating malicious criminal use of the internet, or ICTs, meaning individuals who are not working on behalf of a nation state, still trying to somehow risk the confidentiality, integrity, or availability, or all of the above of data. So I now work with one organization in Washington called Public Knowledge, and they are primarily focused on consumers and protecting consumers and enhancing consumers' understanding of a variety of things. Traditionally, their work is before the FCC, so they're focused on, right now, net neutrality. Mm-hmm. But just to give you a background of sort of where my remarks and where you sit is where you stand, this experience has framed the way I think about these things and why I think we need to think seriously about using the sustainability policy approach as a way to reframe the arguments around cybersecurity. So Lisa gave us a quick rundown of what's happened in the past year, but obviously we have, I think most consumers are tired of, and we are in a space of essentially overwhelmed and no longer care about data breaches. The idea of fear, uncertainty, and doubt around cybersecurity is not an effective tool to get corporations, consumers, enterprises, anyone in this ecosystem, because I do think that it is an ecosystem, to change their behavior, or they're not changing their behavior quickly enough. The Oxford Center recently, I think about 2 years ago, did a study around why it is that we are not seeing enhanced, why some of the messaging and awareness raising around cybersecurity is not effective. And their conclusion was that the messaging is wrong. We continue to use these, if you don't patch your system, you might be victim of an identity theft, rather than framing the message in a positive way, which is to say, if you patch your system, you'll save time from having to go run around to all the credit bureaus and freeze your, again, it's still a bit of a negative because it assumes that something bad will happen. But my hypothesis, for lack of a better way of describing this, is that we need to think about cybersecurity as a sustainability issue. And I will sort of march you through a couple of reasons why I think that that's the case. At the very least, we know that this notion of sustainability, that is preserving an environment and using an environment in a way that will make sure that it is available in the future, has international understanding. Sustainability, the UN has adopted it, had its sustainability efforts in the late 90s and early 2000s. But it is something that is understood globally. We understand, the notion of greenhouse gases, and I know I don't want to take away Brian's remarks, but I know that he, I have often said that analogies in cyberspace, in the cybersecurity conversation break down. I don't think there is a perfect analogy in this space, but what I am trying to argue is that this notion of thinking about cybersecurity in a much more sustainable way is a way to get us to a better place. Because among other things, consumers understand, I'm going to try and buy a product that's green, or I'm going to try and hopefully soon buy a product that's secure. And they will not understand how that product is secure. They don't understand what firmware is. But hopefully we will get to a point, as I'll go through here, where we have developed a set of tools and languages, if you will, a lexicon that helps consumers not understand 128-bit encryption, but that there is encryption there and it is sufficient enough, and therefore I want to choose this product over that product. But that assumes another thing, that corporations are actually in the business of producing products that are secure. There's a chicken and the egg here, right? We need consumers to demand them. We don't have companies wanting to produce them because there isn't enough consumer demand. So this brings me to sort of the first, what I would suggest is commonality between traditional sustainability and cybersecurity issues. The first assumption, I think, is that sustainable practices cost companies and are not effective and enhance the bottom line. But in fact, there are multiple studies from Harvard Business School and a number of others who actually say that companies that have adopted and taken on sustainability are some of the most successful companies in the world. If you look at the Fortune 500, 100, you will find among those companies a sincere and I would argue effective sustainability policy. As Lisa suggested, not taking on cybersecurity into a corporation's business operations at the beginning of developing a product, a piece of software, a security camera for your child's, for a baby room, costs many companies, we're finding out, in the long run. So the argument is, let's build security in by design, but let's take it on at the beginning rather than the end. So you'll hear many security researchers and others say that checking the security of your software as it's about to hit the next piece of the development phase and go out to the market is the wrong time to be thinking about security. We need to be thinking about security at the very beginning. Similarly, I would argue that if you look at the environmental analogy, I think, but I welcome contrary experience from the room. When companies are building or developing, I look at my children's cereal boxes, and the side of the box says, by 2020, General Mills will produce its cereal boxes from completely recycled materials. Many pieces, I would argue, if not all pieces of the supply chain around getting cereal to my house, there is now an assessment of what's green about this? How can we make this more green? What are we not taking away? How are we preserving the environment for the future? But I think we've gotten to the place around sustainability, around sort of the traditional environmental approach to sustainability. It took us a while to get there, and I think we're seeing the same thing in cybersecurity. We are, in cybersecurity, still in a very siloed ecosystem. The computer researchers are on one side, CEOs are on another conversation. We're now trying to find people, and oftentimes it's lawyers, but not always, and risk management folks who can help translate. If you do not help us or afford us the opportunity to better secure this piece of software, it's going to cost you, it's a risk. And quantifying the risk for a board is still a hard thing to do. And I submit that we've gone through this similar conversation in the traditional environmental space. There's also the issue of, as Lisa mentioned, but I'll sort of take another opportunity to highlight it. Particularly as we move into IoT, there is still this notion of being first to market instead of secure to market. That's problematic for a number of reasons, and if it's not clear already, we can't sustain this use of the internet in this way, and the use of internet and ICTs in a way that requires consumers to have to figure out how to patch their systems. If you look at Meltdown Inspector, sure, you can bring your laptop, your Mac, your whatever up to speed. You only have to do these 7 different things, and consumers are like, what? Why don't I just
It's going to slow you down.
throw it out and go buy a new one? Well, guess what? The new one has the same challenges. So there are still some vulnerabilities in the system, not in the hacker vulnerability sense, but the other. We've got some breakdowns. So we need to bridge the silos, and I think the sustainability approach around the environment has been able to do that. I'm not saying that it's perfect. I think it has room for improvement, but I think there are some lessons to be learned from the traditional sustainable approach to the environment that could be applied in thinking about cybersecurity. So we know from, as I mentioned, Harvard Business School and a number of other studies that taking on sustainability policy on an environmental level has helped companies become actually more successful. It's increased consumer awareness. There is greater transparency around the sustainability practices. And I think, again, there are good tools and lessons to be learned to apply to the cybersecurity space because we don't, as I mentioned, yet have consumers who are demanding more secure products. They don't exactly know what to ask for. So we need to build a set of tools to help consumers understand we need the recycled triangle and the blue bin and you're hearing some of these analogies now. We need a nutritional label for cybersecurity. We need an Energy Star label for cybersecurity. What we need are tools to help educate consumers. We have, the lead buildings, this building is probably lead building, the Greenwise movement. Consumers don't understand how it is that the plastic goes into the recycle bin and somehow something magical happens and it comes out again in the gloves that my kid is wearing. But they know that that's something that they would like, and there are corporations who are meeting the demands of consumers. Which came first? I still need to figure that out. The other one that I'll flag in this episode, so we're seeing actually some movement towards this notion of developing these sort of simplified symbols to attract consumers to raise awareness and to demand better products. Scott's mentioned, and I think has written on this work that the Consumer Reports, which is a US-based company that has rated products from toasters to, I think they've done toasters, cars, refrigerators. They are going to start rating products around their security and their privacy. So we will hope that we will begin to see some champions and early adopters to it's what's called the digital standard, it's the Consumer Reports effort. What we need are boards and CEOs not asking only how secure is our network, but how secure are our products. So if funders and boards and CEOs started talking about things, their products, the lifeblood of their corporation, university, nonprofit, the issues are, there are similarities, and the analogy, I think, translates in a more holistic and sustainable way. I think really in 5 to 10 years we could see some really meaningful improvement. But it starts at the top. We need CEOs to think not, and expect that the developers who are writing code, because let's face it, almost every company in the future is going to be a software company in one way or another. They are either developing the code in-house or they are acquiring it from somebody else. The expectation needs to be that when the code comes to whomever it's coming to, that it has gone through a secure development lifecycle, that there is a bill of particulars that the entity that's contracted for or put out an RFP for a particular software system can say, I understand that these are the steps that you took in developing this code, and that it was secure as you know that it can be. It has no known vulnerabilities. So if we have CEOs expecting better practices from within their companies, we will begin to see products that are beginning to meet and getting whatever the three full circles, or however it is that Consumer Reports chooses to articulate, the most secure and most privacy protective products, which will then develop, I would argue, consumer demand for these types of products. Which brings me then to this, the notion of ESG ratings. So environmental, social, and governance ratings. I was talking with a former colleague of mine who's at a huge bank, and I was floating this idea of maybe we should start talking about cybersecurity as a sustainability issue. And she kind of looked at me and she said, well, if it helped their ESG ratings, I bet they would do it. So there is, of course, a point at which, well, so let me back up one second. What I think is also key to this, so we need some early champions and some early adopters of thinking more holistically about cybersecurity from soup to nuts. What we want are companies that begin to compete on privacy and security, not just having the greatest app on your phone, but an app that is actually sustainable in the sense that it's not polluting data. It knows what data it's collecting, it knows the purpose for which it's collecting that data, and it knows what the life cycle of that data is. The problem we have with many of these apps and toasters and toilets is that by and large, the companies that produce them don't know the data that they are collecting. And if you don't know what data you have, you sure as heck cannot secure it. So there are some limits, I would argue. I will transition then to probably Brian, unless Marios wants to go next.
No.
There may be some limits in this analogy, and one of the ones that we've been discussing off and on is whether how does the sustainable framework of cybersecurity, or however we choose to characterize it, does that break down at the nation state level? Consumers and corporations can do, okay, let's say they take on this approach. What does that mean for nation state use of the internet? Well, we know that 80 to 90% of ICT's, information and communications technologies, are owned by the private sector. So if the private sector begins to take a more holistic approach, more sustainable approach, I would argue that a couple of things will happen. It will be harder for nation states to misuse these technologies because by and large, they're not actually developing the technology themselves. They may be developing the exploits, but that's different than the technology itself. They're figuring out ways to misuse it, but they're not always developing it. But it will also make these nation states in some ways more vulnerable to misuses of the internet. So I think, as Lisa was speaking, I was thinking about disinformation, and by no means am suggesting that disinformation and cybersecurity are the same thing, but what I would argue is that disinformation has a net negative impact on the internet because it breaks down trust in the internet. And at the end of the day, the internet runs on trust. If we don't trust the internet and the ICTs which connect to it, we may reach a point where we're no longer willing to use it as much as we do, which ultimately means that the digital economy begins to not sustain itself. So it's curious to me, and I haven't had a chance to really think through this beyond the 10 minutes that it struck me, that the government who's alleged to be behind much of the misuse of or disinformation campaigns around the United States election in 2016 appears to have made a strategic decision that distrust in the internet is fine for them. Their citizens don't rely on it, and they know, in fact, that the Russian government is behind much of what they receive when they go online in Russia. And I won't go too far off on a tangent to talk about internet governance. I'll save that for later if we want to get into that. But compare that to the Estonian population. They have full trust in the system that's been developed. It's striking to me. These are neighboring countries. I lived in Estonia 20 years ago, dating myself here.
Historical comparison doesn't feel well.
No, it doesn't. But it's amazing to me that you have these two different approaches to the system. I'll just check and make sure that I caught all of my notes. So I do think that there's, even with the norms, meaning nation-state use of, whether nation states can adopt and whether the sustainability concept as a way of improving cybersecurity is still applicable in the nation-state context. Because I think it not only is nation-state use of the internet essentially use of private sector products and services. Nation states don't want to, most nation states want to sustain the digital economy. They do not want to break the internet because they know that the lifeblood of their citizens runs through it. And so I think if we begin to see nation states, and this is some of the work that Microsoft, this notion of a digital Geneva, which we can get into that too, and I don't totally support that effort. But I think the analogy continues to follow there. So now Brian will destroy it.
No.
Not at all.
Thank you so much, Megan. That was fantastic. And we don't, I said a round of applause. That's great, yeah. And again, we don't want this just to be an echo chamber, right? So here for a slightly, I think it's fair to say, contrasting viewpoint, we're going to have Professor Ray offer some remarks, maybe in the U.S.-China context, is that right? Or we'll talk
Some examples.
about that? Some
Yeah.
examples,
Yeah.
examples, excellent.
So-
Thank you. Whenever you're ready, feel free to.
Do you have a clicker? Okay. Awesome. So, first let me thank Scott, Emily, and then also add in Teresa Kang and the great staff at the East Asian Studies Center. I've been incredibly well taken care of. So thank you. This is great, and I'm really pleased to be on this panel and excited to talk about it. So I was initially invited through the East Asian Studies Center, and so I initially, as I tried to think about it, was thinking about trying to do a kind of survey of the legal landscape, because that's my expertise is in the law and primarily compliance. And then Scott helpfully sent out to us a sort of framing agenda, not a set one, but sort of set of ideas, and that got me really thinking. And honestly, I had not thought about how I was going to connect the digital privacy laws to sustainability. I figured, well, that's what the other people on the panel could do. But it really helped. And also what really helped is reading his piece, Sustainable Cybersecurity. And in reading that, I mean, I found it very convincing. And so what I'm going to do today is not reject the analogy by any means. I think it has a lot of force and a lot of good lessons to teach. But I think those lessons need to be calibrated, and that they sometimes aren't applicable in some situations. And as I try to think through what I mean by that, it occurred to me that what I'm really talking about is this problem that Megan mentioned of definitions, sort of what is cybersecurity, what's a cyber attack, and when we start to think about those terms and that terminology, and here I'll go to my roadmap, or I won't go on my screen. There we go. I think it helped, and then we think about how that terminology intersects with the complex interests at play. We can begin to unpack and illustrate why cybersecurity is distinct and is different, and those interests at play overlap and are in many ways the same as the interests at play in the environmental concerns. But I think the configurations play out in more, I don't know if they're more complex, but certainly different ways that make that analogy not as effective in some contexts. So let me stop talking in abstractions and let me move into it. All right, so what's a cyber attack? This is a nice quote from a great study by Brookings. We talk about cyber attacks, we talk about cybersecurity as if it's a thing, right? And of course we know that it's very different things, and this is a nice, another analogy to attacks physical attacks and all these things share the use of gunpowder, but of course we wouldn't consider them at all to be the same things. And we certainly wouldn't think from a policy perspective that we would need or want to deal with them in any similar way. So just to break that down a little further. So cyber tech, in my world, mostly I work domestically. We talk a lot about data breaches. I work with a lot of companies, and of course, in the US, one of the big issues is my incident a data breach or not, right? So the definition there is contested in very tactical ways. But data breaches sometimes are and sometimes are not the result of cybercrime. When we talk about cybercrime, we tend to think about, in most cases, not exclusively, but in most cases, an outside actor, right? An outside actor who is seeking some economic advantage, but economic advantage on a kind of a small scale. When we elevate to cyber espionage, we're now bringing into play the idea that there's a nation state involved. And the motivation there could be primarily economic, right? It could be to gain some economic advantage, but kind of on a larger scale to enhance the competitiveness of the country, or it could be strategic, right? And those motivations can certainly overlap. And of course, in most instances, cyber espionage is going to be also a data breach and also cyber crime. And then cyber terrorism sits there with somewhat different valences. We're now thinking very specifically about national security. Of course, national security was implicated with cyber espionage. But we're thinking about attacks on a nation state as nation state that are primarily designed to cause damage, disruption, right? Not to gain some relative advantage in the international space. Okay, and so when we connect those, oh, I'm sorry. I'll try to remember. I'm looking at my screen and doing it here. All right, so there's my not so helpful picture. But all right, and then we look at the interests. Okay, so maybe I'll do that real quick. When we look at the interests that are involved, as I noted, we can map those different kinds of cyber attacks onto these, although not cleanly. And again, as I just tried to emphasize, the categories themselves are not easy to demarcate. And often highly contested in real life, as I'll get to here in a second. So national security, we might think is primarily or more prominent in cyber espionage, terrorism, economic security, cyber espionage, although economic security is threatened by terrorism. It's also threatened by the phenomenon of data breaches, the huge losses that Scott mentioned. And then consumer protection, we think of that as a primarily a kind of domestic issue, right? A regulatory issue. We want companies to be responsible about how they collect, what they collect, and what they use. And then we look at the whole human rights, and there are, of course, a number of human rights implicated, privacy being a big one, but also freedom of speech, and of course, democracy in general. And there in particular, when we begin to think about cybersecurity and cyber attacks and the typology or the variety, often this sort of flips the view, right? Depending on where you sit from a human rights perspective, you may or may not think that there is one or another of these interests being legitimately pursued, right? And so now let me move to some examples real quickly from the U.S. cyber, the China-U.S. context. So the OPM hack. This is a great example. We talked about the difficulties of attribution. Lisa mentioned, allegedly a nation state. And of course, that's one of the huge problems here, and a problem that is it's shared with the environmental context. Often, sometimes it's difficult to figure out who is actually to blame. But I would argue the attribution issues play out slightly differently. And they play out in a way that highlight the complexity of those interests and how those interests may look different depending on where you sit. And so, of course, we know that the U.S. alleges and has pretty strong evidence that China as a nation state was involved in the OPM hack, and so therefore it ought to be labeled at least cyber espionage. And of course, China has said no, it's mere criminal conduct, right? When we look at an incident like, and I keep wanting to call it Oliver Snowden since I'm using this one, but Edward Snowden, the Edward Snowden incident, right? Depending on your perspective, and this brings into play this interesting inversion that human rights often creates, depending on your perspective, Snowden could be a hero, protector of democracy, protector of privacy, or he's a cyber criminal, maybe a cyber terrorist who has greatly damaged not only U.S. standing, but certainly U.S. national security. And then we move to the international stage, and we think about the U.S.-China relationship in particular, because I think that relationship illustrates the complexity at the international level, or puts it into particularly sharp relief. Here's a quote from Lu Wei from the Cyberspace Administration, China. He was writing this in the Huffington Post, and in the context, of course, in these ongoing discussions and negotiations between China and the U.S. about how to interact both with each other bilaterally and then how the international order should develop. And China, as many of you may know, has been very actively promoting the concept of what they call cyber sovereignty. And of course, cyber sovereignty as an approach, as illustrated by this quote, emphasizes a traditional debate going on in international law between international law being primarily law and international norms being primarily norms that are negotiated state to state, where citizens as private individuals with individual rights sit in the background, and the state is responsible for representing and in essence, and also determining the scope and extent of those rights. And also emphasizing the idea that, hey, there's a certain sphere of shared space where we're going to work out how sovereign to sovereign we're going to act and what we're responsible for and what the limits are, but that space is very, very limited. And that space does not extend at all or very much into the individual nation state. And of course, that's very different from what the United States, at least up till now, has promoted, although even the United States, as the Snowden incident and the reauthorization of the Surveillance Act illustrate, the United States is not that different in terms of this tension between the ability of the nation state, both for law enforcement and security purposes, to want to get access to information in ways that arguably compromise or limit the privacy rights of citizens. And then one last example, the 2016 Cybersecurity Act that is now in force in China. It's an incredibly broad-ranging act. It's part of a number of laws related not only to cybersecurity, but to the digital economy and to the internet generally that are part of this broader concept of cyber sovereignty. But one of the most controversial pieces of it is that by 2020, we're talking about 2020, every citizen will be required to participate in what's called a social credit score. That social credit score, and this is, I think, potentially, and I'm curious to hear Lisa's thoughts about in Estonia, one of the risks of putting everything on a digital ID that is, I think if I'm correct in my understanding, is embedded indelibly in a chain, right, in a blockchain where you can get, or at least pieces of it. Well, you can educate me more later. But anyway, putting all of your activities as an individual, your health records, your voting records, that creates tremendous opportunity for state control and state surveillance. And that, from the United States perspective, is something that we're ambivalent about. It's not something that, as again illustrated by the Surveillance Act reauthorization, it's not something we go out and say, we need it. Whereas in China, the perspective is more as, hey, this is what we need to do to be successful, stable, and secure as a state. And again, that's a very different perspective, and a perspective when you look at these issues from a human rights perspective is at least problematic. And again, that complexity I don't think exists quite as much or to quite a degree in the environmental movement. I don't think you have that same inversion where you certainly have competing interests, right? But those interests tend to align at least a little bit better, certainly when you think about it from a long-term perspective and even from an international perspective. There is less of, I would argue, a zero-sum game than there is when it comes to cybersecurity. And certainly when it comes to sort of alignment between the state and citizens, maybe not so much state or citizens and corporations, but state and citizens, there's less of this possibility for deep tensions and perhaps, and to some degree, irreconcilable tensions. Okay, and then, so I'll just leave us with the thought, and it may be trite, but I think it's a nice quote. All analogies are, of course, imperfect, and I think we learn as much by exploring those limits and trying to understand where those limits are and why they're different. And of course, that's what lawyers do. That's the case method, right? As we do from embracing them. And I want to stop and end with the argument that I think that's particularly true when it comes to cyber. This comes from a book called Understanding Cyber Conflict 14 Analogies, which actually recast and redeveloped a set of analogies that were part of a study done by, I'm forgetting the original one, but a group of military personnel, and it came out of a discussion about the limits of those analogies. And so they present 14 analogies, and then in each of one of them, and particularly in the editorial introduction, they explore those limits. And so I think that's really important because there are a lot of analogies out there, and some of those analogies are more or less helpful. Cyber Pearl Harbor is one. The nuclear proliferation, whether that is, how useful that is. And of course, I think the same can be said for sustainability. So I'll stop there, and thanks.
Thank you so much.
Well done.
And last, but certainly not least, Mark, I'm not sure if you'd like to stay or whatever you like.
No, I'll stay.
Be
I'll stay.
comfortable. That'd be wonderful.
But
Would you like
probably
to?
I'll need the mic.
Excellent.
Hi. Good morning. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. First of all, good morning to all. Thank you for having me here. I would like to thank the University of Indiana, the School of Global International Studies, and in specific, Ambassador Islamabadi. Thank you for having me, Ms. Jenny Webeck from the Center for Middle East Studies. So thank you very much. Allow me to continue a bit the discussion from the three distinguished speakers, and I'll be very brief. It seems that what it will be much more useful for me to stress is more the operational information that I have coming from the Arab Gulf and not the Persian Gulf. The reason why I'm saying this is I believe that three notions were made possible, and three things were said here: data, information, sustainability, and the other one is resilience. And these are some of the key aspects that the UAE government is keen on, and these are words that they frame into a strategic vision and that they make possible through an operational vision. So what I did while the three speakers were talking, I made a small structure of how to present to you what's happening right now in Dubai. And it's quite interesting because everything that is happening, reflecting whether this is cybersecurity or cyber resilience or security resilience and so on and so forth, has very much to do so with the development of other places, countries, and mega cities. And this to include is also the city of Dubai. So allow me to frame the reason why it's possible. The environment. Not the environment as the climate, but the environment in which we apply the case of cybersecurity or cyber resilience, if you want, and how we can combine it to an emerging country with an emerging societal structure that is now looking forward to the 21st and 22nd century. Sustainability is a notion for the environment. It is an analogy, but it's also applicable analogy in the case of Dubai. There are, the United Arab Emirates government looks at it from the point of view of vision, so they go from top-down approach. So they have the UAE vision 2030 for the United Arab Emirates, but the Emirate of Dubai, it's a federal system, so it has 7 emirates. The city of Dubai has 3 different sets of visions. The vision 2021 on becoming a smart city, so therefore we also include cybersecurity. We have the framework of 2071 about the future aspects on how the future should look like. So Dubai, as you know, is very futuristic, and the strategies behind it are very futuristic themselves. And there is a link between societal structure and the future, because there is no background history. We're talking about 46 years of sovereign state. So there's no history as such. There's local indigenous history, but not as a state as it is today. So they're looking at the future. So they're paying very much attention to the future. So 2071 is very important, but there's also another vision, which is the 2235. So in the year 2235, they would like to have colonies on Mars. And as you can understand, we're talking about a lot of technology being applied. Now, initially, when somebody reads it, says, okay, well, these people are thinking, you know, far-fetched into the future, but can they do currently? You know, what do they do currently? They do what is called mega projects, mega dealings. World Expo 2020 is the very first case. The World Expo will bring around more than 60 and 70 million people around the globe in the city of Dubai, where the infrastructure needs to be properly established, but the area itself needs to be safe, secure, and the region around the United Arab Emirates needs to be safe and secure. Why? Logistics, transports, operations. So we're talking about 4 specific elements. We're talking about capacity building, operational building and evaluation, testing, and further evaluation. So we're talking about risk management and constant assessment of the things that are tailored or applied in the city of Dubai. Nothing would be ever possible to be dealt with and to be done with in terms of that resilience, if you want, in security, namely in cybersecurity, if the economy would not allow it. People know the United Arab Emirates as an oil-rich country, but in reality, it's oil-rich and services provider now country. And I'll give you some data where the issue of data information and big data is now on the rise. Dubai has grown for 3.5% in 2018 without the introduction of the VAT. It is estimated that big data of info will allow the United Arab Emirates to be introduced with more specific and sound information, something that the Western world does not really acknowledge in terms of when you want to share data, what are you sharing, where do you do your statistical information, so on and so forth. The United Arab Emirates and every single company, including oil services, gas services, security services, and so on and so forth, they're now creating a big data archive. And as you can understand, also these archives need to be secured. There are KPIs, key performance indicators, that are based on the evaluations on how things are going to be done in order to meet the requirements as on meeting the strategic requirements of the UAE Vision 2030, or for the city of Dubai 2021 to be a city, a mega city such as Singapore. So the competition is with major cities that do already are already hubs such as Hong Kong, Singapore, Moscow, New York, and so on and so forth. The growth in technology has been immense. For the simple reason that there was no background information about the people that were coming in, and suddenly people need to give a lot more information than what one would suggest. I'll give you a very recent example. The government has decided that for the renewals of the residency visa, because almost nobody gets a passport to be in the United Arab Emirates, as long as they work, they can be there. But now they want a good conduct certificate from your country or the last country they've been at before. A second issue is that they now suddenly request also an attested birth certificate. Why? Because they want to have a complete set of information about this personality, that it's safe ground when he or she works, and that they will be utilizing on a good and positive way for the United Arab Emirates. And it makes sense. If you're residing there, it makes sense because the country itself is very safe. It's very safe in the sense that I can forget my wallet here for 2 days. I'll come back after 2 days and my wallet will still be there. And that's the thing that the United Arab Emirates is known for. Now, the growth has been, to this day, 2.9%, which accounts for 376.8 billion dirhams, which accounts for $102.6 billion. They have balanced accounts. And they are a profitable country that is mainly run like an enterprise. So therefore, they do the enterprise risk assessments every year. They don't have a deficit, and even more so, the introduction of the VAT system starting 1st of January 2018 is a result of the cooperation between the United Arab Emirates with the World Bank, the IMF, and the World Trade Organization, which means that the United Arab Emirates is slowly but steadily joining the Western world in not only sharing data or creating data, but being a role model and a hub in the Arab Gulf of 1.2 billion people. Having said that, I'm going to the geopolitical challenges that exist there now. And there are some very important geopolitical challenges. One of which is the not very good relations anymore between Qatar and the GCC countries. Some may say it's political, yes. Some may say it's security related, yes, absolutely. Some may say that other countries are being involved which are not in the GCC, having already inspirations of becoming former rulers of the area, yes. But there's also a financial issue and there is also a technological issue. The game fight between Doha and Dubai is about economic emergence and technological emergence. And Dubai leads those two. If you go to the city of Dubai, you will see the technological companies, you will see the cybersecurity companies as being their hub for the Middle East. But you will also see the financial hubs, banks, global banks, local banks, regional banks, emerging banks, new banks. They're all there. Doha wanted to have this inspiration, and they couldn't. And that's one of the arguments as a fight that's been going on from 2013 onwards, so it's not a brand new element. Other geopolitical challenges, probably you already have seen, you already read about it, Yemen. Yemen war is an unfinished business. And Yemen war, I don't know how it can reflect the end of this conflict, but Yemen war has become more like, it attracts attention from the world, but at the same time it has become like a black hole where everything is not finished. In the region, this means that the region cannot be totally stable as long as there are other issues, the Iran case being involved, Turkey being involved in Qatar, suddenly Turkey being involved in Somalia. There's just a surrounding between all these countries that there is an issue. Then there is the issue and the element of Saudi Arabia and the sustainability and growth or openness, or how much can the openness of Saudi Arabia can be continued. In this case, the United Arab Emirates looks and sounds as very stable. And this is the only stable country that can provide the emergence of relations. A recent example case is between the United Arab Emirates and Iraq, the United Arab Emirates and the post-conflict era in Syria. And a very important case example is the project of New Cairo, which cost for a foreign direct investment of the United Arab Emirates to Egypt more than $5 billion of investment in just the direct area, which is only real estate. So imagine the logistics that comes behind the real estate, which is also the technological hubs and so on and so forth. Now, in terms of imports, we're talking about 1.28 trillion dirhams, which accounts for $345 billion, which means that there are more inputs on exports, on imports, but there are also now exports. There are suddenly companies being emerged. And suddenly there is a UAE vision on cybersecurity, on resilience, on robotics, on genetics with robotics, on the mixture between medicine and technology. And suddenly you see Hyperloop being implemented there. You see Sophia. Have you seen Sophia, the IE robot that was in Saudi Arabia? Well, it's a company based in Dubai. And they want to implement it there as well. The Dubai police is now has robots running around the malls initially. And you have small, tiny helicopters, that I call them, they're running around the streets of Dubai giving you a ticket when you're speeding too much. So it's not only the cameras anymore. At the same time, the identity, the Emirates ID. The Emirates ID is the same thing like Estonia. Not so much on the house key that I heard, but it gives you all the details. Who you are, where you are, what's your banking account, what is everything. For some people, it may be a bit scary because you got all the private information. I don't know if you've seen that old movie with Will Smith, The Enemy of the State. That's how it sounds. And it looks and it actually feels as well. But I also feel safe. I also feel safe because I know that the government there is protecting my interests. And me being there, it protects me as long as I am there. So what's the future look like? And allow me to just elaborate on specific elements about why cyber safety is important, therefore cybersecurity. We're talking about aviation development, industry development, pharmaceutical, medical, metals and machinery, but we're also talking about university developments, outer space exploration, so resilience also in security. All these industries, or if you want the sectors of industry, require every single company and every single local or federal government to be cyber resilient, which means give data, get data back. Complete the data information, be safe on the information, do not lose the information, do not give fake information, even in the media, don't give fake news away. So what is the role in terms of cybersecurity? You have the Cybersecurity Electronic Agency that was set up by presidential decree in 2013, and Cybersecurity Electronic Agency was initially created for the Emirates ID for Dubai, so there's a similar one in other Emirates. But Cybersecurity Electronic Authority created also Cybersecurity Strategy, which was inaugurated last September. Cybersecurity Strategy aims to do the following: establish a societal structure through fourth generation leadership and technology. Talking about Davos, yesterday the new minister on artificial intelligence signed an agreement with the World Economic Forum to create a center for fourth generational development, which actually also includes the Dubai Electronic Authority. Therefore, cybersecurity becomes an element of parallel society that we live at. Because the majority of the Emiratis are the expatriates that are living there. And we all use our cell phones on everything. I don't know if you've seen the rule of Dubai. Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, he stood up like this, and I want everything by 2021 to be done like, through a cell phone. And everything is done through a cell phone, to be frank and fair. Leadership. We're talking about a leadership agreement of 1.2 billion people. So if Dubai can lead, the rest of the Arab world can adapt to these new situations and can become more resilient towards their own national goals. And I think that's what the United Arab Emirates is doing at. They did apply the ISO standards on international security, and they do have an ISO standard on cybersecurity as well. Usually in academia, we don't really take case of the standards of ISOs, but ISO makes sense from the point of view of national security, of supreme security actions, presidential affairs, going down to operations. There are challenges. There are about 50 million attacks per year of cybersecurity attacks in every single aspect of the industry of the UAE, and the majority of them go to bank services, but also private accounts. Private accounts meaning emails or bank accounts, it doesn't matter. The problem is legal, because the laws that are applied in the United Arab Emirates are twofolded. Anglo-Saxon law in terms of trade, but there's also Sharia law that is applied in certain cases, especially when it comes on private issues. Now the banks use the Anglo-Saxon laws, but they are not yet to the extent fully in compliance with the regulatory authorities, not in the sense that they're not showing it, but they need to do more changes in order to be more safe. Now, seeing it from the external point of view, joining the IMF or the World Bank means that the banks need to share information. Who do they have as clients? I'm taking it on a different scale, protecting your own bank account. And that was an issue, I saw it in front of me, where I remember the chief financial officer called the lawyer of a specific Arab Gulf bank. And he said, we've got to change this now, post it on the web right now. And that was done live. I remember I was in a law firm working on cybersecurity and the banks on that one. There are, as I said, legal issues. Political issues is the stability or the emergence of the Arab Gulf of 1.2 billion people as the next best thing. There is a personality issue. What is the personality issue? What's the identity with which you recognize the United Arab Emirates? Do you recognize an oil-rich country, Do you recognize it as a touristic country, as a safe haven country, or do you recognize it as a part of the international community that gets involved into a lot of elements, including peace operations and so on and so forth? And they have to decide this. So what are the outcomes? What do we understand from this? There's still an awareness process that has been built up in the United Arab Emirates. Not so much only for those staying there, because we live the very best of technology, but for those who are coming or the ones that are going to go back to their own respective countries. Sharing of information and sharing of knowledge is not only a management issue, but it's also a cultural issue. And the United Arab Emirates has now been involving more the cultural aspect and the dimension of exchanging cultures and so on and so forth, in which cybersecurity fits there. The culture may be different in between our country, but cybersecurity unites, cyber elements unite us, and therefore security as well, or protectiveness of our own account. There is a holistic, that was mentioned, approach, and it's a multidimensional now approach. So we're not talking about any more third level approaches to security, but we're talking about fourth level. The UAE government is protective of itself, it's protective of its citizens, and because they need to have operational control for one simple reason. 985,000 people are the local indigenous people, 8 million people are the expats. Okay? The government, the objective now is that through the VAT and through all these changes, through the big data processes and so on and so forth, in the petrol and gas, which actually still is the lead, but coming from Abu Dhabi. I remember last week, I was with the Minister of Energy, Al-Mazroui, His Excellency Al-Mazroui, where he was talking, he's now leading also OPEC, and he was saying that big data and cybersecurity are very important elements for us to create, to share, and to show to the world that we're there to help. And that's very, very important for those that are dealing with this. The societal structure is very important because society will be mixed with cyber elements. Whether we like it or not, the internet has become part of our lives. I have iWatch, I have 2 phones, I'm more wired than everything else. As I said, the attacks will never stop. It seems they know where it's coming from. It's coming from Iran for the obvious reasons. But Iran, just to name you a few things, not the government of Iran, but there are private businesses of Persian interests. There are more than 365,000 registered businesses in Dubai. So politics is politics, business is business. Okay, I'm just dividing those two. However, the attacks are there, mainly because they want to have fun, I think. They want to see if their reaction is and what it is. Iraq, suddenly from Qatar as well. So I don't know if you've seen the balances of alliances between the GCCs and non-GCCs, those who want to be friends with or not. But just because of that, they want to be protected as well at that level because they fear that an imminent attack like it happened in Estonia in 2007 may be also imminent for the UAE. There is a steady process of development, and I think I will conclude that. It is called sustainable policy. There is the new policy of the UAE government and the Prime Minister's office talks about sustainability on all levels, including education, market services, tourism, health, and technology, including cybersecurity. I would take it a further step. I would not only talk about sustainability, but I will also talk about sustainable growth. Growth is what matters, not sustainability. Okay? So thank you very much for this talk. I hope I give you a just small overview. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So there's certainly lots of directions we can take the conversation from here. Thank you so much again, all three of those. That was just excellent. I have just a couple of questions on my end, but I'll be signaling in just a minute to start asking your own questions, okay? At that point, we'll start lining up the microphone, okay? But just to get us going here, there's a couple lawyers on the panel. So for first question is kind of legal, and then we'll do a business and sustainable development question, then we'll open it up, okay? So the legal question, there's been a lot of international legal principles that have grown up over the last few decades, like polluter pays, like the no harm principle. And I'm wondering, and for that matter, due diligence. I'm wondering which of those you think are most useful in thinking about contemporary cybersecurity challenges. Like a big part of Talon 2.0, most recent Talon manual, was on cybersecurity due diligence. So I'm wondering, is what we're talking about just repackaging, due diligence in a different form or not? So I'd be curious to learn, Megan and Brian probably most particularly, what you think of some of these environmental law principles, how much they help us in this context, and where they might hurt, frankly.
You want to start?
Sure.
Yeah.
So the challenge, I think, with the polluter pays analogy, this is where I think it breaks down, is that we're still dealing with attribution. Polluter pays assumes that you know that trails, what is the Canadian case that I think Jay Healy cited. I agree in the concept of thou shalt not do to one's neighbor what one doesn't want done to itself. So we don't want to have, as a government or as a corporation or as a university, we don't want to have universities leaking data. So we don't want we don't want to have countries spewing greenhouse gases. But our ability to identify who was behind the breach that leaked the data, assuming that we don't have secure systems, I think is where the polluter pays notion is problematic. And the other one that you cited just left my...
Oh, it's okay. So, for example, the effects principle we could talk about as well. So there's a different, idea there of stuff that's happening outside of a country's borders. A country should have some say in how that's regulated. So this comes up a lot in the climate context. It comes up a little bit in cybersecurity, like the rights of neutral countries, for example, but it also can fall apart. So I'm not sure, Brian, if you had anything to add.
Yeah, so I would agree with exactly that point, that the polluter pays principle is problematic, one for attribution, and and this is again where I think this is the place, right, in the international scene where the analogy runs out or has the hardest time working, and that's again because of the perception and the reality that this is a national security problem, right? And so when you think about the debates that are going on at the international law level, so first of all, the legal constructs, as I think Lisa, you alluded to this, there's war and then there's everything else, right? And getting to cyber war, no one or most countries I think are pretty much aligned in terms of not wanting to have a cyber war. There's the similar set of interests that play out in that context, but those are very different from in the environmental context. We're really talking about trying to get to a point of a recognition of an environmental war is actually going to be destructive to all of us in the long term. Whether something short of cyber war, and where that line is, I'm not sure, but whether all of the other things that are going on, and I am gonna encompass the sort of disinformation campaigns and the kind of things that were going on, not the hack itself in the DNC, but the very effective and not that sophisticated social media efforts that were engaged in allegedly by Russia. When we think about and when we think about how those interests align and whether they map onto the environmental movement, I think it's tough, because I'm not sure that Russia is entirely incorrect in evaluating both its certainly short and medium term strategic interests and also the relative effectiveness and relative low cost of utilizing the kind of tools that they use. Now, their game seems to be pretty unsophisticated. Megan and I were both at an event last year where Adam Siegel spoke, and he's written a book, and he made the great point that the difference between Russia and China is that China is really playing the long game here. And Russia is very effective, and they've been very creative in being sort of disruptive and destructive. But you don't see the sort of long-term investment in technology that you see coming out of China. And it sounds like the UAE has a sort of similar game plan. When you think about that, there are clear alignments, right? If you're going to be effective in doing what the UAE is trying to do and what China's trying to do, you can't have widespread behavior of the kind that Russia is demonstrating. That said, especially from the perspective of a country like China, to maintain internal stability, to maintain the kind of control that they perceive as critical to national security, you have to have access to that data. And you need to have, and that access, and getting access to that data, getting that kind of information, inevitably is going to be in tension with security in a way that I think over the long term, there's greater alignment and greater convergence in the international. And so sorry, it was a long-winded answer, but getting to polluter pays, I'm not sure that a nation state, qua nation state, is willing, one, the attribution problem illustrates this, is willing to sort of commit to that kind of community regarding concept. Now, due diligence, I think, might be a little bit different, but I'll stop talking.
Oh, no, that's
Yeah.
fine. And that is where a lot of the action right now, though, is developing these cyber norms below the armed attack threshold, right? What should those look like? There's been actions at the G2, the G7, the G20, the UN group of government experts until it fell apart recently. We can maybe get more into that later. I don't want to go too far in the weeds here. Picking up on the sustainable development thread a little bit, I was shocked by this statistic. Maybe you guys have heard this as well. I had to double check it. Bitcoin mining now uses more energy than 159 countries. Isn't that amazing? 13% of global energy output. It's amazing to me. And for that matter, 5% of the energy being used in Germany now is based just on internet services, and that's growing quickly. So I'm wondering, as regions like the UAE are developing in a sustainable way, ideally, as countries that already have been at the kind of the digital bleeding edge for some time now, like Estonia, what responsibilities does the tech sector have? What responsibility do governments have to help make sure that we develop these new technologies in a sustainable way as possible, right? Especially with the growth of cryptocurrencies that could even contribute more to this this load on the grid. And I'm wondering, Mars, if you had any thoughts on that or anything you'd like to share?
As I said, we now make our own stuff. So
There you go.
we have the Emirates coin that's coming up.
This is wonderful.
And I have a feeling that because we live in a country where the wow factor makes sense, I think that everybody's going to buy, and I think they're going to beat Bitcoin, to be honest. Yeah, if you see all the money that is around the UAE, and if everybody bids like $1,000, let's say, and they will go up. No, it's a joke, but the blockchain technology is something that is very much interested. It is interesting to the government. To be again frank and fair, they did put several articles about the Emirates economy, blockchain, digital currency. I don't know whether the central bank and all central banks are quite happy about it, because this is also a banking issue. It's also a legal issue. But they would welcome it as long as it makes sense operationally for making businesses safe. That's why they have agreed and accepted to have Bitcoin ATMs. That's why a lot of people became suddenly more millionaires or millionaires in the UAE with Bitcoin. But it's not only Bitcoin. People reflect only to Bitcoin, but there are about like 39 other cryptocurrencies inside there. Litecoin is going good, for example, and some other things. It's not clear. It's not clear what it is. Data mining center, if you're talking about that one, I would consider it much more doable in the sense of business that, you know, the UAE may be like something welcome, a data mining center in the middle of the, you know, inside desert, because they have just the space to accommodate this. So I would say that they'll be more interested in that logistic element. In the security element, yes, they would actually welcome it as well in order to find out the appropriate sources to understand what it is. At least that's what I would do. Now, in the case of securing the coins or the mining or all this in terms of energy, allow me to say that the UAE is building 4 nuclear plants in Baqarhat, outside Abu Dhabi. And already they tried to, they sent a missile from Yemen to that one, but it was intercepted, one of the 2. The other one just, I don't know where it went. And at the same time, they're building coal mines, modern coal mines. And they have some very interesting case. The subcontractors can be also paid in Bitcoins. That's interesting in terms of data sharing, because we don't know where the Bitcoin, what is the actual amount and who creates the amount and what is the exchange rate mechanism in those things. But what I can say for certainty is that everything is interrelated between each other. If you want to understand the UAE, or if you want to understand the future of the world, at least in that Gulf area region, you have to understand that every single company is interrelated with each other, not only in terms of safety, but in legal affairs, in operational affairs, in strategic affairs, in the logistics that come about. And don't forget that the city of data, which became Dubai, was created due to logistics. And logistics and data, if you want, are the things that are going to give a further approach, because Fly Emirates brought me here, direct. That's why. You went halfway around the world with one stop. Well, no stop, actually. Well, one stop in the actual airport to check in. So this is the future, and I think that's how the UAE thinks. And I think this is the part where, it relates with China. China would like to do that. And funnily enough, China learns a lot from this Arab world. I don't know if that satisfied.
Data the new oil, after all, right? And if you guys would like to, please feel free to start lining up at the microphone here. I'll do one last question while you guys get organized, okay?
Could I just jump on just real quick?
Oh,
just,
please do. Yeah.
No, so I think that's a great example, and I mean to address it in the different kinds of IoT that's come up. I think there in particular, right? I mean the massive DDoS attacks that Lisa mentioned are a function of the fact that there's not sufficient economic incentives to secure those. And the real hard question is, well, who is going to take responsibility for that in a complex ecosystem? And absolutely, I think in that context, so I wanted to come back. As Megan pointed out, I think there are absolute ways where that's where the environmental analogy works pretty well. And understanding sort of how those have played out and how those incentives have played out, I think, is important and can be really useful in terms of trying to create the right incentives for the device manufacturers or whomever is going to be responsible to take responsibility for making security part of it. So, yeah.
It's an ecosystem, right? And that dovetails pretty well with internet governance discussions, which we can get into later, and whether we think of this as a multi-stakeholder system or more of a multilateral state-on-state system. So I will table my question now that we're organized, and please feel free, sir. Yeah.
I'm Martin Speckler. I'm a professor of economics here.
That's right, Martin.
My question is, to what extent do effective solutions for cybersecurity require some kind of universal coverage? Now, in the small countries that we've talked about, Estonia and the UAE, both of which seem to be aspiring to universal coverage, although my experience in Estonia and in the Arab world indicate that that's very, very far from being true today. And in the United States, as a former city official, I can tell you, you cannot get people to do the right thing universally. They won't even shovel their walks after a snowstorm, even though it is a $50 fine if they don't. Now, it seems to me that the only force available to us at this time for universal coverage has to do with Facebook and Google. They are the most universal forces in the world today. Not the UN, not the USA, certainly not the Arab League. And I'd like to know whether you think that Facebook and Google have a role in this, and whether we need antitrust legislation in order to affect favorable change.
So can Google and Facebook help save us from tragedies of the cyber commons, right? And that's another economist cover right now, Taming the Tech Giant. So this is perfect. We're just ripping from the headlines left and right. Who would like to jump on that first, and vis-a-vis the role of these multinationals in helping with this problem? Brian? Yeah.
All right, I'll jump in real quick and then
please.
A couple points come out. So first of all, when you said universal coverage, I thought you were talking about insurance.
I initially thought that as well.
That's a topic. Absolutely. I mean, insurance is one of the levers that can work and already is working in this direction, and it connects up with the ability and to begin to aggregate data in really refined ways, right? Which again has sort of a dual-edged sword. But in terms of Facebook and Google, absolutely. And one of the challenges, and again getting back to the China relationship, is the differing obligations they have. And one of the big trends, and it's a big part of the 2016 law, is data localization. Data localization is nominally always about security, right? It's part of GDPR. It's part of what's going on in China. But it also is about data control. And again, that's where there's this dual-edged sword to it, but I'll stop with that.
So I don't really have a good answer, but it's something that I've struggling to say. So one of the recommendations, President Obama, before he left office, convened a panel, a commission on enhancing cybersecurity, and one of the recommendations was to move security actions away from consumers.
Mm-hmm.
We need to figure out a way, if we can, to produce devices that are relevant, where appropriate, automatically updatable, so that we don't need to go and you have a 1 on your gearbox on your Apple device or whatever it is on your Android device, and you have to figure out, oh, guess what? I don't have enough data. I don't have enough space on my phone to back it up or whatever it is, and so I need all of these steps that we take to make the ability to be secure complicated. And I thought, well, is Facebook a way? How do we change the messaging again? Is Facebook a platform in which we might be able to help educate consumers and at the same time draw corporations in, because we know the corporations love Facebook because that's how they reach the masses.
Until now.
Until now. And this is where I think there are a couple of problems with the Facebook and Googles of the world, which is that they consume, develop, trade data in ways that we have no understanding and we have no control over. So whether antitrust can address that, I'm not entirely sure. If it's sort of breaking up monopolies, or if we need to sort of have a new paradigm around and sort of return to first principles over user control of data. And so I think it will be interesting to see in a couple of years what the impact of GDPR is on this notion of the consumer has rights to their data, they have rights to have their data deleted. I think as we've
how it's used.
Yes, I think we're about to see the reckoning around kind of social media companies and the consumption of data without consumer awareness.
And just so I'm say, GDPR is General Data Privacy Regulation. For those of you who don't know, this is a new law coming into force in May in the European Union.
Yeah. No, it's not on. So I'll just speak loud. You've raised three issues. You've raised a political issue, you've raised a technological issue, and you've raised a legal issue. Okay? And I will go with the first one, with the last one, the legal issue. The United Arab Emirates has a respected government that is in agreement with the United Nations Charter. The United Nations Charter says exactly about the elements that need to be handled in order for a country to be recognized by the UN. Now, why did I say this? The UN Charter speaks about tolerance, right? There is a Ministry of Tolerance now in the UAE. They speak about respect, and there is a Ministry of Respect. All the elements associated, including to cybersecurity, need to be included in a legal framework like the GDPR that is now also in regulation in the United Arab Emirates with the Presidential Decree of 2013 and now 2017. Having said that, you spoke about the universality, and the universality on cybersecurity protection needs to be established by the United Nations itself and then be applied, to be legally binding and be applied through other countries. And this is not, we're not there yet, because we do not define, or we're not able to define what are the limits of the internet and who creates the internet, who regulates the internet, who controls the internet or not. Now let me jump on this on the political matter. This is where the sensitivities come with the Arab world, and I can understand that, because the internet was meant to interconnect people and bring people closer together. However, you also need to apply it in societies that are directly receptive, but in order to be receptive, you got to share the same traditions, cultures, and understanding from where you come from. And that's where the lack of information exists in terms of society, cultures, and so on and so forth. That's why I spoke about traditions and cultures of the UAE. In the Arab world, for me, as a non-Arab, in order to live and survive, if you want, or develop in the Arab world, you have to understand the Arab world. You have to understand the mentality and the perspectives and the way that it's seen. And I can tell you with certainty that considering the technological advances and the fast advances of knowledge, information, and education, they are very globalist. The Arabs are very globalist in understanding the world, or being in the world, or traveling to the world. Do not forget that in global history, They were traders. Yemen in Sana'a, which was the first capital of the Arab world, there was trade always. In Mesopotamia was trade always. In the Arab Gulf, which used to be like, Oman, which used to be one country, the UAE was coming later. Trade. And cyber elements, the internet is about trade. Now, social media is also about trade. And guess what? Facebook has a Middle East center in Dubai. Are they regulated? Yes, absolutely. Because every single company that opens in every single country needs to be regulated with all the permissions from the local government. This is what they have to do. Are they permissible to do the change that they do? Yes, absolutely. What about, you said the Arab League. The Arab League does not take this low-level decision. It's more like strategic level decisions on sustainability, on growth, on good sovereign relations, and so on and so forth. The Arab League follows the rules and regulations of the United Nations itself, so it doesn't deal so much with business. And that leads me to the final step, which is the business level. As so far and as much as companies would like to be promoted through Facebook or Google or anything else, permissive. And it's open source. All this, what I'm telling you, is open source. It's not closed source. It's not regulated source. It's not evaluated source. You just have to be, to go, to reside and feel how things should go. This is the only way that you can actually develop there.
And guys, I know we're pushing up against the coffee break, but maybe we could do something of a lightning round and at least get to these two questions. So please, feel free.
We'll be short.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, my name is Justin Boer, and I study in the International Studies program here. I have no background in informatics or computer science, so I apologize if my question's a bit simplistic. But cyber infrastructure is improving the world over. However, cybersecurity and intelligence services aren't necessarily keeping pace with threats and vulnerabilities. I'm very interested in intra-Asian developmental agencies and initiatives. So this question is focused on the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which is dedicated to improving both physical infrastructure and cyber infrastructure throughout Central Eurasia. Many of those nations, however, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Azerbaijan, they lack sufficient intelligence services to effectively curb increased cybercrime and terrorist activities that would come from an improvement in online infrastructure. So my question is, what should China do to limit the proliferation of crime and terrorism in Central Eurasia? Should it follow through on its cyber infrastructure promises to developing nations?
Yes, yeah.
Do you want to take them both and then we can
I think that's a great idea, yeah. Oh, yeah, please, yeah. Would you like to add on to that?
Really quick, I'm Levon Schlegel. I'm with the Institute for International Business at Kelley School. This week, I have the privilege of working both in the developed world and in the developing world. There were two articles this week that kind of caught my attention. The first one was about the gentleman, I don't remember his name, but he tipped himself with an RFID chip in order to be able to pay his credit cards and sign on to his computer or whatever. And there was also an article in the development literature about the Rohingya state. Problem in the Rakhine state in Myanmar. And they were talking about the refugees and refugee identification and the use of digital identification to identify those refugees that are in Bangladesh who are trying to go home and making sure that people who left can go home and the people who are there really should be there. So my question is, I have real mixed feelings about that on a micro level, individual level. Both sides of that to me seem kind of odd. I'm interested in what you all think, not only about that, ethically, morally, all of that, but where does it take us long term as the cyber world becomes more and more workable at a micro level, not just at a macro nation state level?
Okay, Levon, that's great. Yeah, okay, last but not least, absolutely, please, yeah.
Thank you. My name's Kate. I'm in the Kelley Masters of Science and Information Systems program. And this question comes from what Megan was speaking about, which is education of consumers. And so based on the analogy with the sustainability movement, there's organic certifications for products, and consumers trust that as a good sign of a responsibly made product. So what organization would be qualified to provide a similar certification for something that's secure? And do you think that's a necessary part of consumer education in this area?
Absolutely.
Thank
Maybe
you.
we'll take them in the reverse order. So we have a question about consumer reporting, for example. We have kind of macro versus macro, cybersecurity, and then China's role in Central Asia. Who would like to take the credentials one? That probably makes the most sense for kind of a public knowledge viewpoint, right?
Sure.
Would that be good? Yeah.
So yes, I think the challenge in figuring out the tools to translate complex security to consumers so that they feel like they can trust whatever the symbol is. There are a couple of challenges with it. Organics, I guess, is one that sort of is universal. I think the symbol is very similar in other parts of the world. Energy Star is something that's unique to the United States, I think. And the question becomes, whose best practices are the right best practices? We have best practices of best practices. So this is where we have a challenge in this space of figuring out the appropriate stakeholders and process to develop certifications that are universal, because we have the equivalent of LEED buildings in Europe. I think that there are. So I would argue that we don't need to necessarily have the exact same symbol universally, but essentially the same principles that are embodied by a particular certification process. And the tools that one of the tools and systems that's been used in the industrial control system cybersecurity process, so tools that control major, for example, the electric grid or the dams, so highly critical systems, the vulnerability of which and the sort of compromise of which would have a significant impact on the environment and society. They're using the ISO standards, so ISS, the International Standards Organization, which is developed through, again, it's not unique to the United States. So I do think we need to have some kind of labeling system, but the question is whether we need to have the same labeling system across the world. That's going to be problematic. But if we can agree on a set of, we're all going to go to ISO is one of them. The other one that's very prevalent and has participation from across the world is the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force. So for example, if you take botnets, there are best practices that have been developed through the IETF through what's called a multi-stakeholder process, which includes universities, civil society, governments, and industry. There are known best practices that will significantly reduce the development and effectiveness of botnets that we could deploy throughout the ecosystem, which would have a meaningful impact, but we have an incentives problem. So there I will stop.
No, it's really helpful, Megan. And for what it's worth, some jurisdictions are trying this already. So the UK has a Cyber Essentials Plus certificate. So UK companies can go to the British authorities and have their products labeled as best-in-class cybersecurity. So there's a lot of experimentation happening in this regard already around the world. And then so we have kind of citizen vis-a-vis the role of the state, micro, macro cybersecurity challenges, as well as China's role in Central Asia. But if anybody wants to even broaden that to China's role in promoting different cybersecurity internet governance standards around the world. Brian, Marian, what do you think? Yeah.
All right, we're not using that. That's right. It's not working. So I'm familiar with the Open Road, One Belt, One Road initiative, and also familiar with sort of its cognate in Africa. I have not focused in on the details of building the cyber infrastructure and the question about China's responsibility in doing so for making it secure or ensuring the security is an excellent one. I mean, one immediate thought was, well, the United States isn't very good at it inside our own country. So the problems exist. Although, as we just discussed, there are clear solutions. And one of the questions is, to what extent is there or should there be an obligation, if you're going to build the infrastructure as a nation state, to forego possibly your own security interests in favor of ensuring security. So certainly, I think that case is very easy to make and clear cut when it comes to corporate responsibility, which is the kind of standards that we're talking about here, and that governments enforce those. When it comes to nation states, and especially with Chinese ambitions, I actually know it better in Africa, and there's clear tensions that, notwithstanding the fact that China's investment has created a number of jobs and built infrastructure that was useful both domestically, internally, nonetheless, it's also pretty clear that they have prioritized their own or to a large extent prioritize their own strategic interests, and that has caused conflict or at least issues cropped up. And I suspect that there's a real risk that that same mix will play out in the cyber infrastructure context. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
So I have real concerns about the Belt and Road Initiative because I think it's, it's obviously a platform. If there comes a time where we have state-on-state conflict, there is a runway, both figuratively and technically, to basically everything that China has deployed around the world. So it's a great intelligence platform. It's a great tool to exert power, whether it be through ideas or through exerting physical power. This still isn't working, I guess.
It is.
It is, okay.
Yeah.
So how can China be a good partner in extending and building capacity and infrastructure around the world? It can, as Brian I think was saying, choose to forego, among other things, deploying tools, trinkets throughout the infrastructure. But also I think there should be significant pressure put to China around the transparency of not just the technical information and communications technologies that it's deploying and building cellular systems in China, or in Africa, but also the burdens that they have placed on the governments. So it's often, is my understanding that, you can pay us some percentage of the cost for us to build this runway and wherever it is. But the reality is that the terms of that agreement are such that the developing country cannot meet them. So China essentially owns the infrastructure and is now owed a great debt. And at what point will China collect it on its debt? And what sort of outcome will that lead to?
I don't know if you know the difference between Amazon and Alibaba. You know the company Alibaba, right? The Chinese. Amazon wanted to open a hub in Dubai. Alibaba wanted to open a hub in Dubai. They were in competition. The UAE said, well, you're welcome both. That's all there is. There's no competition. As long as it's business, there's no political competition. So the more they're welcome to open. There are some difficulties in both cases. So what did Amazon do? It bought off a company called Souk.com, which is basically the same style like Amazon. So instead of them making a hub, they just bought already hub there. Whereas Alibaba is now trying to open the hub of logistics over there, if they want to open the logistics. Now, there are two things I would like to concentrate on, and I wanted to say about Alibaba because Alibaba represents the fourth generation technology and the investment of the Chinese, how fast they're going. I can assure you that the Ministry of Foreign Trade of the UAE has done a very good deal with the agreement with the Chinese, and the Chinese railway as well. It does construction, real estate. I don't know why it's called Chinese Railway. As a real estate development, but they built fast in the UAE, and they got some mega projects as well, like highways and stuff like that. So the Chinese are everywhere at this point. I think the only thing with the Chinese, which is not exactly taking into consideration, they want to now avoid creating ghost cities that they did in Africa. So they would like to have tangible projects that will have an impact, and people will talk about it because it's called indirect marketing for them. Now, in terms, there were two issues that were mentioned about the refugees' identities and all these things. Technology has an issue, has an impact on refugees, but this is a very important issue that cannot be discussed on a business level. It has to be discussed on a leadership level, and the refugee issue is a non-ending story. The most important question before the refugee issue is how to avoid war, how to end conflicts, how to stabilize countries, how to develop countries. That's how you stop the refugee issue. On education, you do that. Now, you mentioned the case of Bangladesh, for example. The UAE is full of Bangladeshi workers and employment opportunities that they are. I think the UAE, what the UAE does is you must be invited to come. And at the moment where you're invited, they start filing the work placement, who's going to do this and that. And this is the only way that they can keep a track of who is and where they come from at this point, utilizing technology. There's no writing stuff anymore. There's fingerprinting, there's face control, there's everything. And in China, face recognition outside the street is much more vivid now than anything else. It takes them 6 to 9 seconds to recognize you in more than 200 places at the same time. And I think they've taken this example from England. I remember in 1998, I was a student in England at a city called Lincoln, where Margaret Thatcher's from. And they had 2,500 cameras. And in a city less than 40,000 people back in the days. So that was quite scary. There was a camera following us everywhere. And I think because of the British, because the British were implementing a lot in the technology of security cameras and so on and so forth. But I think that there is a flaw there. The dependence on technology 100% is a flaw. Is a flaw. You have to be able to think yourself as a human being, and you have to be able to self-defend yourself in case, for example, if I lose my phone now, and if I lose all identities and bank accounts, what do I do? Just commit suicide? I mean, think about the most simple thing. Like everything goes down. There's no electricity. There's no nothing. What am I going to do?
Can't do anything.
And I think that there is a flaw. Finally, just to say the following. In terms of security resilience, I have to repeat myself that security is not anymore the traditional element of war, peace, organized armies, and so on and so forth. When you are educated in, when you're defining intelligence or intelligence sharing or intelligence development or protecting the infrastructure, protecting the homeland and all these elements, at the level of cybersecurity, which is much more important than everything else, there is background structures that are there to protect and safeguard people which are resident in this country. So in the United States, you have the Cybersecurity Center of the United States, which I think Ashton Carter was the first director.
Depends on which center. We have lots of centers.
No,
US Cyber
the
Command?
Cybersecurity Command.
US Cyber
Cybercom,
Command.
Yeah.
General Alexander, yeah.
And I think politically it was Ashton Carter was there. I think before he became Minister of Defense. So this is a very basic thing, but in intelligence, I think the intelligence sectors around the world, I think they know what they need to know. Even if you do like degrees in education, in terms of intelligence, you have to do the 4th generation cyber war, cyber games, and so on and so forth. Maybe not on a technical level, but rather the strategic level itself. Thank you.
That's very helpful. And that's actually a great segue to the second panel, but we'll do that after our coffee break, which will be freedom versus security. Is there a sustainable balance? First, thanks for sticking with us. Please join me in thanking our excellent presenters this morning.